Approaching 1 minute. All systems nominal.
Welcome to Returning to Base, a Mechwarrior Living Legends podcast. This week's episode is sort of a continuation of last week's episode on game meta. Last time we talked about the meta in game modes like Solaris Arena, Team Solaris Arena, and in organized matches. Today, we will be talking about terrain control in mostly public games and a little bit about terrain control in organized matches as well. Our guests are the same as last week. We have Kidzin, Direwolf, and Leeko. And as always, I am Warlord Kentax, your host. So without further ado, here it is. Alright, so, terrain control. What is it?
Terrain control is the main game mode of Mechwarrior Living Legends. As the name implies, your goal is to control the objectives which are scattered throughout the terrain of a given map. Usually there are 3 to 5 objectives. Sometimes there are more, and sometimes there are less, or as few as 1 on like a King of the Hill style map. In a public game, there's a pretty narrow selection of official maps and unofficial maps which have received a lot of care over the years. And in organized play, there's a much wider variety because the player base is a bit more familiar with them. But most of the time, the flow is pretty similar. You start at your main base, you go out into the map, capture objectives, and you have a bit of a back and forth between the teams as one team pushes into the other's territory and either captures their objectives or fails, retreats, and gets counter-pushed. And you go back and forth. You earn C-bills by capturing the objectives in addition to dealing damage and getting kills. So over time you get bigger, and as you get into bigger and more powerful units, the dynamics can sort of evolve to where, as I'm sure everyone should know, assault mechs tend to be slower than light mechs. So it can become more challenging to control the map the bigger you get. There's sort of risk-reward elements there. I don't want to get into it too deep, but that's basically what you can expect out of a standard game of terrain control.
So was terrain control a game mode that's an original creation, or was it inspired by something else?
Well, it's pretty similar to the Battlefield games. It's my understanding.
Yeah,
Very
I mean,
similar.
it also reminds me a lot of my favorite Arma 3 mode, Capture the Island, right? It's kind of same jump, but I mean, it's probably been that type of mode like for years and years. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if it came from like 90s or 80s even. But yeah,
Right.
I think it's the concept of it is kind of easy to understand. Maybe not so easy to execute for players, right? They just don't get the priorities right, but.
Another comparison people have made is PlanetSide, although we don't have any resource gathering elements, which are present in the first PlanetSide game.
In a second too, although it's not like a main focus of it, right? Main focus is the capturing points and
Right.
holding them. But yeah, just like Leeko said, the main objective of the mode is capturing various objectives. They can vary in the number, also in the purpose, right? That's the important thing, the purpose, right?
I forgot that part.
Yeah. I was like, is he gonna mention it? So there are secondary bases that are one of the key elements of the terrain control. They can often have like limitation of what mechs you can spawn, like the weight limitations, but not often. You can rearm at them, but sometimes you don't. And instead, there can be points where you just rearm, or just the points where you repair. Also, there can be points where you just grab it, but instead it has the highest score modifier that takes down the enemy's tickets, right?
Does
I mentioned that.
Does the distribution of different bases and different ticket values, and whether or not they have a spawn point or a mech bay at them, does that alter the meta for any given map?
Oh, it does.
Yeah,
definitely
100%.
does. Yeah.
So that was something I was just going to mention, is that that's really the variety of Living Legends where you find it is the differences between the size and number of objectives on maps. And the objectives themselves can either just be a point you capture, like Kidzin said, or a mech factory, or a repair bay, or an ammo depot, or all of the above. And so the metagame can be very different on different maps, because, for example, on a map like Urban Jungle, a rather notorious map, because almost all of the bases on that map can spawn almost any unit. So you have, your Atlases and Direwolves rolling out of forward bases that are only a few hundred meters away from each other. Well, the action doesn't move very far away from that middle area. And you don't see very many fast units like Black Lanterns or what have you, other than to capture the objectives on the very outside of the map.
Probably these days, the map design, the way the map kind of works is a little bit different, because the out of the way points are worth a lot more than the middle ones now. So there is a good reason to be somewhere in between. It's about force projection.
And I'm kind of jumping around here, but this is something I mentioned previously in case anyone forgot or is jumping around in our podcast here. The point of capturing all these objectives is to reduce the enemy's team tickets. So the objectives may have different weights. So you might control the mech factory and the repair bay, and they have a combined weight of 1.5. But the base in the middle of the map that has no extra function is worth 3, and the enemy has it. So they're actually draining your team tickets over time. Your tickets are bleeding, is what people will usually say.
What are the tickets for exactly?
When your team tickets run out, the game is over and you've lost. And you use them up when you respawn, and they also decrease when you die. And if you're in something bigger and fancier, you lose more team tickets.
So is there an aspect of the meta where you might use a smaller asset that's worth fewer tickets?
Yes.
I don't think it is, but I don't think it's something that's usually considered in a pub game, ever.
I would say that that's
Disagree,
incidental,
but yeah.
in that the reasons that you would use those units aren't specifically because of their lower team ticket cost. I'll return to the example of the Black Lantern, which is a 55-ton mech that goes very, very fast. 130 kph with mask, I believe. So that's basically the premier bat capper unit of the middle to late game, which is specifically referring to going behind enemy lines to capture their objectives, forcing them to spread back out and retreat into their own half of the map. So a Black Lantern is worth fewer tickets than, I don't know, a Nova Cat, for example. You might be able to afford both of them, but if you really need to break up a concentration of enemy force, you might opt for the Black Lantern, because you can go capture one of their objectives, and someone will have to leave their concentration of force and that way you'll actually get more done than if you roll up in a Nova Cat and just shoot at them and they shoot back at you and you return to base. Then, well.
Hey, that's why this podcast is called that.
Name drop.
Indeed. I would say, though, that actually considering ticket value is something that I personally consider a lot when I'm playing in TC, whenever I'm down tickets mostly.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a situation where you have very few tickets left over, and maybe say you're losing really hard, maybe alright, so Leeko made kind of the comparison between a Nova Cat and a Black Lantern. Maybe you could afford both, and they're actually fairly similar in price. But those are two very different roles. Say instead that I know that what I need to do right now is that the most important point on the map is being held by a lot of enemy units, and we need to push into that point. We have a decent number of side caps, but we're still bleeding a lot, or maybe we're not bleeding a lot, but we're still a fair bit down, and we need to really make up the remaining difference. We don't have the time remaining in the match. Yeah, or you are, but it's just not enough. The only way you could is if you get that particular. So I have that amount of money, and it's okay, I can choose a Nova Cat, or I can choose a Warhammer or something, or maybe a mech that's worth a little bit less. The idea is that I probably we're going to have to move aggressively, say, and I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to survive whatever fight we're in, or it may even be better for me not to live through the fight, because then if I die, then I can respawn in something fast and do force projection elsewhere on the map if necessary. In situations like that, then I do consider, do I really want an expensive both expensive in terms of C-bills and expensive in terms of tickets. Asset that, like, if I die, like, I could potentially lose the match for my team or make it a lot harder to win, versus something that I can afford to die in and I can afford to play more aggressively in, and like kind of give more chances for myself and for everybody else. This is like kind of still like a bit of an edge case, I think. Like, these are pretty exceptional situations, like where you really have to consider, well, do I really want to spend the extra 4 tickets for, like, the slightly less firepower or the less mobility or whatever. But it is like a serious consideration that can come down whenever, like, tickets are really narrow between teams.
Yeah, I know that back when the harasser with the flamethrowers had 6 of them instead of 4, it's still good, but I mean, it was better back then.
Now.
It was, or it could melt things better back then, right?
Yeah, but so just going back to what Darrell said, right? Because he said he doesn't agree with me when I mentioned the fact that it's not something that's taken into account. What I meant, of course, it matters and it's important, and it's taken into account by veteran players in general. But let's be real, like, majority of players don't really care whether them dying in something heavier changes the course of the game. Often they're just beelining for the point, just going in there and dying. That's kind of what I meant. It's not something that's in the in a wider consciousness of players. They don't account it as much as points themselves, which often leads to the downfalls of team, where just people keep on hopping into the expensive assets and keep on repeatedly dying. And despite having advantage, it just can melt really quickly and lead your team to defeat.
Yep.
Because otherwise, I absolutely agree with that.
With a lot of new players that haven't been able to try out all the mechs in an actual pub game, maybe they've only been able to build them in the test server, and they actually want to, in the free play server, maybe they actually want to be able to play that big stompy mech in a terrain control game. They might go for that big stompy mech, even though it's not a good choice for the current situation, either because it's worth too many tickets, it's too slow, not maneuverable enough, something like that.
I usually don't see that as being too detrimental, though. For players who can't regularly get into those types of assets, and like occasionally I've seen this, where there's somebody who like isn't like a super experienced player, or they're very green and they buy like an Atlas or something. Like, even if they don't perform all that well in it, or if they die without inflicting equivalent ticket damage or whatever, it's usually not enough to like sink the team, because like it's only one big loss, like, or one like kind of chunk loss. The thing that like really drains a team's tickets quickly is like players who can consistently get into like Mad Cats and then consistently walk into the enemy team and explode with them. So then you're like constantly losing like 13 or 14 tickets or whatever every time this person decides to walk in the enemy team. I think that's like, whenever somebody talks about like ticket bleed in terms of like, even when you have map control and like, kind of throwing assets, like that's, I think, what people are thinking of.
Technically Atlas is worth only 1 ticket more than Mad Cat, so
Yep.
It's the same thing, honestly. It's
So
actually worse, but
in the same time it takes to get that Atlas into combat.
yeah, I was about to say it takes more time for them to die in the Atlas than in Mad Cat, of course. But,
I guess, by the time you bring 2 Atlases to the fight and have both of them die, the other player's taken 3 Mad Cats and had them all die.
But yeah, that's kind of what's hidden attribute, in my opinion, like in grand scheme of things, because players that are experienced with the game will know that and will play accordingly, just waiting the risk of losing their asset to what team can gain. But the ticket cost of losing asset in a terrain control, it's often what makes the game. And like early on, losing lights to grab the points, it's absolutely worth it in general. Like, because lights are not worth much, and just grabbing and holding that point for just a couple minutes will already outweigh the loss of those light mechs. But the moment where people start hopping to like clan mediums, or heavies and so go on, that's where, sure, holding points is still very important, but you really shouldn't be dying. The kill death ratio isn't important for, oh, look how much I killed, right? It's more important not to die in those big stumpy things.
Yeah.
The
Terrain
only
control is often all about that risk and reward balance there.
the only big downside to dying a lot early on, because it doesn't like actually hurt your team very much, just as you were saying, Kidzin. And it's not going to cost your team a whole lot of tickets. Like, for example, today on Warzone, I know my team lost pretty badly, but early on I went as battle armor, and sure, I lost us 4 tickets or something really quick, but that's not a huge loss. It wasn't a big problem. So even though at the end of the match it looked like, oh, I've had so many deaths, well, some of those were low-ticket deaths. The other thing to consider, though, about lots of deaths early on is how much you are feeding the other team, because I know that the ticket bleed, the rate at which the tickets on your team go down from your opponent having more captured bases than you, that rate is actually pretty low to start with, and it doesn't start picking up pace until a few minutes into the match.
10 minutes.
10 minutes, yeah. So at the very beginning, if you have the option between capturing a low, or capturing like a, I guess to put it in a better context, so capturing a forward spawn with a mech bay and everything, that's a really high priority, of course, because that helps you project control over the map for the rest of the game. But say maybe there's the high ticket value post in the middle of the map or something like that. If you have the choice to go capture that or go kill an enemy in the beginning of the game, you go kill the enemy and then capture that post later. The delay or the extra points are worth more than the delay.
Yeah, that's an excellent segue. I was just going to talk about that actually. Because like team tickets, as we established, an individual player in a pub game is not going to often weigh, is this worth more than the other? What am I risking in terms of team tickets? Start thinking about C-bills more often, and how do I get something that can get me into a bigger thing, that can get me into a really dangerous thing that I can kill lots of bad guys with. That's kind of more how people are thinking, right? It's all about the economy. The team tickets is only one side of it. And terrain control games are usually about an hour. They can end faster than that if one team runs out of tickets, but they're pretty long. And usually, in my opinion, the deciding factor is which team sets up their econ better in the early to middle phases. Because by the end of that game, most of the players, if they're not cycling in and out and they've been there since the start, they'll be in heavy to assault mechs, depending on the map. But the team that set up their econ better early on will have more advanced heavy and assault mechs, or will have them sooner and keep the enemy from having them for longer. And getting to clan mediums and to heavy mechs in general quickly can be very oppressive, because they kind of sit at the intersection of firepower, armor, and mobility, like all three. The heavier mediums and basically any of the clan heavies, I mean, all the mechs and tanks and everything are great. The balance in this game is great, but clan in particular, because they're more expensive and have more dangerous weapons, and they're all pretty fast, so they don't sacrifice map control. Whichever team can get a lot of those on their team faster than the other can set up a very solid advantage.
Assuming they don't lose them in a team fight or throw them
Right.
away individually.
And
But
also
yeah,
there's a certain
important.
window where if not enough people jump into those heavier things and project the control them up, like especially on a key objective, there is a certain window where enemy, because of being in a lower tier assets, it's not probably well-known mechanic for many still, but if you're firing at the mech of a higher tier, you get multiplicatively more points and money, right? So there's a certain window where people, when one team can upgrade like into mediums, and the other team can dish out sufficient damage into those mediums with their lights, that then just leap over mediums and hop into heavies and just cream the enemy, even though the enemy seem to have certain advantage early on, right?
Yeah.
So now we're getting into some advanced veteran metagame, I would say. But this is something I really love about Living Legends, is these, I guess you could call them rubber banding mechanics, or comeback mechanics. It's almost like the way it works in a game like Dota, which is another game I love, and another game that I regard as a shining example of well-balanced multiplayer. The more you build up an advantage on your team, the more you stand to give away if you die. I think that's really beautiful. And an advanced player will actually know the tiers of different assets, which is a whole separate category, separate from team tickets and everything else and money. And certain mechs, like the Commando, for example, you might say, why would you ever buy a Commando? They're all about 30,000 to 35,000. The lowest rank is 43,000, and there's other heavier mechs with better guns, even in the starter bracket. Well, say you're joining halfway into the game, and you're in that Commando, which is a lower tier than the other starters, and therefore makes more money, and you're shooting at clan heavies, which are very, very high tier. Well, you're going to leapfrog right over them into the assault mech of your choice if you manage to survive a fight or two. And you've got bigger, scarier teammates to hide behind and enable your presence in the game there.
One important thing to note about tiers is that you're not just making more C-bills, you're also making more points. And those points contribute to your rank, so even if you die, you'll still be getting more C-bills faster.
Yeah, it's actually like what Leeko said as well. It's not even about like being late joiner. Like something comparing starter assets, something like Commando, which is like tier 1, I think. I don't think there's tier 0 anymore, right?
No, there isn't.
But there's other starter asset that's Owens. And the difference, I think, is like tier 6, tier 5, something like that, between Owens and Commando.
Because of the electronics.
Something ridiculous. And the difference, Owens will gain 30% less C-bill shooting the Commando, and Commando will earn 30% more. So, and it can really spiral out of control sometimes. If the Commando player can keep on dishing out damage and not dying, they can suddenly have an assault within 8-10 minutes in the game, and that can also be turned into a very stompy game, assuming, of course, he doesn't feed too much in that assault as well.
Right.
To find out the tiers, listeners can pull up the wiki. It's wiki.mechlivinglegends.net, and if you look up tier, it'll actually have a chart there that will show you every single asset in the game, mech, tank, battle armor, whatever, and it'll show you what the multiplier is for each of those. And so just looking at it, for example, the Commando is tier 1 alongside the Mithras. And so the Mithras and the Commando are making more C-bills and more points for dealing damage and contributing to the fight than any other asset. And in tier 2, you've got Harassers and Chevaliers. And so those two are going to be getting a really high multiplier. And so when your Harasser shoots, even just a starter Raven, they are getting considerably more C-bills than the Solitaires that might be shooting that Raven.
Of course, the converse is, or the trade-off, of course, is that these types of assets are usually a lot harder to stay alive in. They're always slower, sometimes they're worse armed, or they're more lightly armored. So the good thing is, like, you do have a lot of freedom to screw up, because if you die, you're only losing like 1 or 2 tickets or whatever. But it's like an interesting part of the learning curve of the game, or rather, maybe not learning curve, but skill ceiling, where it's like to be a really good Living Legends player, like in my opinion, you have to not only be good at like using like really good assets, like okay, once I'm like in a clan heavy, you have to be good at like managing your aggro and putting out all your damage, staying alive, but also just like before you even get there, it's like, okay, I want to take something less than what somebody ordinarily might take at this tier or at this rank or whatever. And I just want to get more money so I can get into something bigger faster. Leeko was saying.
That's what used to, like, I still cry over Solitaire just bumping into tier 4. It was such a fun to use it when it was low tier. But I think one thing we kind of haven't touched yet for the pub game, especially, is aerospace, which is a very sensitive topic for me. And
yeah, people love them or hate them. Aircraft are a divisive topic.
So
also really talked about tanks too. And
tanks. Tanks are more similar to mechs. At least I'd say they are. Because, well, they're on a goddamn ground and they capture objectives, and they're just moral profile. Generally, More armored, although at least they can spread armor as better in some sense.
Usually fewer
But,
weapons.
Yeah, and usually fewer weapons, not always. Some pack a lot of punch. Generally, also, I would say they are more cost effective, honestly. I'd say they're most cost effective. The main drawback of tanks is their maneuverability. A lot of them are really slowish, not all, but slow. And Crysis Engine also has their special physics that can result in some very unpleasant experiences where your tank might get stuck, flip, or God forbid, friendly mech step on you, and then you have, other reasons to be upset. But honestly, I wouldn't say that the difference between tanks and mechs is as significant, as with aerospace, which is, it's a big topic for pub games especially.
Right. Well, so we can speak more generally about how the combined arms aspect comes into play of the metagame. So that's interesting because each different unit type kind of has its own niche, I would say. Aircraft are an interesting place to start because they're the most radically different from mechs, which are sort of the base experience of the game that everything else is contrasted to or meant to interact with. So,
actually, forgive me for interrupting you. Do we actually want to add something particular just for the terrain control, or because we kind of are jumping more?
Right.
Kind of my fault, actually. More like asset focused.
No, I'd like to hear about the aircraft.
All right. Fair enough.
Well, so I was going to speak more specifically about how they come into playing terrain control, though. Thank you for focusing me. So aircraft are kind of funny in terrain control because I feel a lot of new players come in with this mentality of finding a play style that they like and kind of sticking with it 100% of the time. Like to take a different example, a different game like Mordhau is a first-person sword fighting multiplayer game, and to read, just try a bunch of different weapons till you find a fun one, and then use it every game, all game, until you know how to use it really well. Mechwarrior Living Legends is not like that at all. I would almost tell a new player to try to learn as many different things as you can once you're comfortable with the basics. Because I'm trying to figure out a good way to segue through this. So, Living Legends has a lot of different counterplays and a lot of different map situations and a lot of different play styles. And if you try to focus on one of them and you don't understand the dynamics of another, a player who does can kind of have their way with you. And it'll be very frustrating, and it might feel like, we often see people say aircraft or battle armor are overpowered and that they can't, I literally cannot kill them. Please nerf.
A good analogy might be rock, paper, scissors, for example. And if your opponent knows you're always going to pick scissors, that can be a big problem.
Right, so you don't want to only play scissors. You need to learn all the play styles at least a little bit. So I always tell people who are very frustrated with aircraft, just spend some time in them, and then you will learn all the ways they die, and you'll get much better at killing them.
You should tell me that, mate.
Aircraft. In terrain control, they're kind of finicky because they're either very good or very bad. Most situations, they'll be more of a detriment to your team than not in general, because you're not going to be sharing armor directly with your teammates, and you're not going to be pushing onto objectives with them on the ground.
They're very difficult. It's very difficult to use aircraft to capture bases.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, on most maps, it's literally impossible, and on the maps that it is possible, it requires a great deal of skill to do without suiciding. And repeatedly suiciding in your aircraft, or repeatedly getting shot down by the enemy team because you just fly straight towards the nearest enemy every life, is a good way to single-handedly throw the game for your team. So we do see a lot of that from new players who come into Living Legends and they're like, wow, this is so cool. This is the first Battletech game I've ever seen where you can use the aerospace. I'm going to fly all the time. This is so cool. I'm busting out my HOTAS. And then every game they're like 0-20, and you're begging them to go back on the ground, like, please. And on the other extreme, You have players who are good enough to land their Sparrowhawks on the objectives and capture them on some maps. But I would say where they have their best use in general is finishing off retreating enemies that would otherwise survive, repair, and preserve their team tickets. Especially in a narrow game where every one of those kills really matters. And the kills matter more and more the later you go into the game, when people are in assault mechs and such. They're worth a lot of team tickets. And
would that lead
last...
you to pick a bomber more often than, say, an attacker or a fighter?
I would say bombers are probably the most common in general, because they're the most optimized for air-to-ground attack. And the most optimized for what aircraft are really best at doing, which is what I just said, because the last thing you want is to sacrifice yourself or your teammates and almost kill an enemy assault mech or whatever, and then have it survive, So an aircraft will get you that kill, and that's why people love bombers. And there's a bit of a rock, paper, scissors game where, attackers are good at fighting anything, and fighters, right? I believe we might be moving to a new nomenclature, calling them interceptors. That's been discussed, but they're optimized for shooting down other aircraft. But there's a lot of you have to know exactly when to use all of these things, because if you grab a fighter and you shoot down the enemy aircraft and then they get in a tank, well, you're not going to be very useful, and you probably don't have enough money from one kill to get something worth having on the ground. Well, it can be a bit problematic. Those kind of nuances are why I say that they're very situational, and more often than not can be a detriment to your team.
I actually have a fairly long point to also address some of the things Leeko said. So, but unless I don't know, Direwolf, maybe you should hop in if you have something to add, and then I'll comment on that as well.
Not especially. I think Leeko covered it pretty well. Leeko flies aerospace a lot more than I do in terrain control. But I basically feel the same way. Because they're so situational, I'm usually pretty reluctant to pull them out in game, just because it usually seems it's like this is very specific situations where you need to be where like they're actually effective, or at least more effective than something on the ground. There are specific situations, mostly where, like for example, if the enemy team is invested very heavily in artillery and it's a big map and you can't get there easily by like with a single ground asset, and you just really want to be able to project a lot of force, really threaten those specialist assets, or maybe if not an artillery asset, but maybe say some really mobile jump sniper or something that like it's just very hard to respond to. Or also if you need to like deal with the back capper that's very persistently taking important points on, say, like stone rows, whereas a lot of open ground and a back capper can't easily hide, like a really big ticket drain. Like aerospace are really good because you can blow up stuff quickly, and you can kind of project force anywhere on the map against isolated targets. But unless you're very, very good at that, and you're really good at managing aggro and hitting all of your guns and all this, like you're really not making the best use of the seed builds you spent on that. So that's pretty much how I feel about it.
Aircraft are creatures of extremes. They can either be extremely detrimental to their own team, or they can be extremely clutch and extremely oppressive to the enemy team.
The general rule of thumb that I've found for when to use an aircraft and when not to is, does your team control the majority of the posts, the majority of the bases on the map? If your team doesn't currently control most of the bases, then that means you need somebody on the ground capturing bases or pushing in on the places that your opponents are defending so you can capture a different base. And aircraft just don't let you capture, and they don't let you bring the armor to share with your friends. So if you are down on caps, it is a good idea to stay on the ground.
Traditionally, you can cap with aerospace, but it's hard to do, and only certain aircraft can do it. And it also depends on the map. But Sparrowhawks and things like that actually are really silly if you absolutely need to get something to cap a point at the that has a bunch of enemies between you and it.
That's really an edge case, though.
Very much an edge case, but it's a silly one, and it's one that some very good aerospace pilots will use.
When I'm choosing to take an aircraft, at least in my case, I'll be taking a bomber pretty frequently, just as Leeko was talking about. I'll take a bomber to blow up enemies as they retreat. But in other cases, I might take a fighter. And usually if I'm taking a fighter, I'll be taking a fighter that's good at painting targets like with a narc. So that would be like the medium X pulse laser Corsair or the medium pulse laser Sula, because they both have narcs, and that can be really helpful for my team. They're also really good at shooting down enemy airplanes. And they can do enough damage to targets on the ground, not like a bomber, but it's enough that they're still halfway decent at it.
All right, so if I may, if I'll be rambling too much, just please bring me back. I have strong opinions about aerospace, and especially in terrain control and in pub games, because in organized play you usually see like 1, maybe 2 per team, right? And no more than that. They're limited actually, forcefully. So Leeko made a lot of great points. Absolutely agree with him. What I kind of want to focus on is, first of all, when often you might play with low number of players, please don't take aerospace, because with low amount of players, suddenly just losing that one extra body on the ground just makes all the difference, because usually you don't contribute as much with, especially with the lower tier aircrafts, as you would on the ground fighting with people sharing armor, what Leeko said, right? And capturing points.
I have to echo that strongly.
Yeah, and it can be very detrimental and very unfun. The early planes, again, I'm talking like in a broader scale, because great players, there are some disgusting aerospace players. They can grab them, they can land, capture points, but that's the also other thing, right? They can be some players can be very oppressive with aerospace. Also using the mechanics we discussed earlier, when they can earn a lot more money by using certain assets against certain assets, they can suddenly jump into some sort of heavy bomber, like God forbid Shiva or Xerxes, right? And the map can shift a lot just based on those players, because the great players will be able to absolutely obliterate any viable mechs on the other side without much counterplay, because the moment aerospace fighter comes first, usually there's no AA in the other team. If there is some, it's very limited. Maybe it's a mech that can look up high. Maybe someone just grabbed rogue partisan. But aerospace can be very swingy, very oppressive in the right hands, because once you learn how to fly, you can attack from very hard to defend from angles, right? Someone is just flying from top of you. You know that you're getting bombed, but your teammates might not necessarily notice it yet, and you just cannot defend yourself. That sort of thing. So that kind of brings back to the point where the feeding of an enemy team can be very painful when it feeds someone that's really good with aerospace. But aerospace can be very swingy. Can either win you the game, crash those heavy mechs, can lose you a game because you repeatedly get shot. Maybe you're just not good. Nothing wrong with that. You'll learn eventually. Or there maybe an enemy team just went really hard on anti-air focus, and then you bleed a lot of tickets. So yeah, air is something that's probably the hardest aspect of Living Legends to learn, both to play as and to play against. And can be frustrating. So a lot of patience is required with that topic, and at least for me. I don't know if you guys agree with that or not.
It's interesting that you bring this up. It's really interesting that you bring this up, because it just happened to me last week, where there were 5 players on each team, and we had a very good aerospace pilot on the enemy's team, and so my team couldn't really do anything to that aircraft early on. It's difficult for us to pitch our torsos up high enough to hit it. We took weapons not anticipating an aircraft to be there, and so we got pretty thoroughly owned by that experienced player. And and then other times, late at night when there aren't a whole lot of players and somebody on the other team goes aerospace, but they're not very good at it, they just don't contribute to the fight, and their friends are just getting outnumbered in every single conflict. And in that fight that I was in last week when we ended up trying to bring some anti-aircraft assets to bear, and when we did, we just got crushed in the ground game because the mechs that were attacking us on the ground were better at fighting things on the ground than our anti-aircraft assets. So it created just this really unfun situation. And I remember that the reason why in Chaos March you had to have at least 6 players per side in order to have an aircraft was because that was about how many assets you need per side and how many players you need per side before you can justify bringing a dedicated anti-aircraft asset. And but that was a continuation of an old rule, which I think it was 420 ME that originally made it back when he was community manager, way back during the early days of Huntress. And I mean, he didn't run Huntress, but he was involved in sort of establishing some community rules, and that was sort of like a gentleman's rule they had going for a while.
That's not a bad rule. Aerospace in a 12-player game, anything, especially anything smaller than that, is not fun to play. On your team, and not fun to play against at all.
Based on the skill of the players, mostly, yeah.
Playing against a skilled player is going to be very frustrating because you're not likely to have a lot of teammates covering you. Because, the best defense from an aerospace diving you from directly overhead where you can't shoot back is your teammates. Well, the fewer players there are on your team, the less likely there are to be players covering you nearby with the right weapons. And something that bears mentioning, I'm not sure exactly how on topic this is, but I feel like the concept of dedicated anti-air is a much abused one in Living Legends. It's almost never worth buying something with the explicit intention of shooting at aircraft with it, unless the enemy aircraft is so oppressive that you cannot win the game unless you do that. Because once you've shot down the aircraft and accomplished your goal, well, you've hamstrung yourself. You've got something that you're only wanting to kill aircraft with, and there's no more enemy aircraft. Because if the other guy's smart, he's not going to keep diving into your guns. He's either going to go somewhere else, or he's going to sell his aircraft. And then you've got an anti-aircraft stick with nothing to hit.
Well, I mean, it's not like, because, let's see, what dedicated anti-aircraft does to it, right? We have Rifleman, Partisan, Huey.
Right. Well, so design-wise, I wouldn't necessarily describe anything as a dedicated anti-air unit. It can be used for whatever, but it's about the mentality you go in with it, right?
Just look at all the time,
Yeah, the Ultra AC2 Hewitt can kill anything, right? But if you're sitting behind your whole team staring up the whole time, you're not really helping. Not unless there's an enemy Shiva that you absolutely need to be watching for at all times, right?
Yes, yeah, especially with that particular Hewitt. It's got Angel Electronic countermeasures, and if you're not up there with your friends, you're not helping them. Yeah.
That kind of brings us back to train control as a whole, and kind of another thing we kind of, just the map awareness is like, and your surrounding awareness is also incredibly important, right? We kind of went over it, I think, when we were talking about the points in general, but being aware where enemies are, where they are going, and what your teammates are doing is like, it's also incredibly important for everything, for any counterplay by both sides, and yeah.
Do you all have any idea of what maps assault mechs show up at a much lower frequency than others?
Ivory Tower is the first thing I would think of.
Ivory Tower is a notorious no assault map because there's nowhere you can repair an assault except your main base.
Yeah.
And the paths through the map, unless you have improved jump jets, which assault mechs, even with improved jump jets, have a hard time navigating vertical spaces, they're very convoluted. So, a objective that might be 1 kilometer away might require you to go down 1.5 kilometers of road because it twists through some strange path. It's kind of like one of those maps. And so it can be fun to fight very moving fights on, but if you get something like an Atlas that can only go 54 kilometers an hour, you're going to suffer.
Yeah, lack of those repair paths other than the main makes assault, again, a very nice piece to finish off by aerospace, especially when they're trying to retreat to the main base, right? Usually very low. They just get shot on a retreat. But yeah, generally big maps where like the main points of contest are often far away from repair pads.
Yeah.
Probably like open spaces where assault mech can get easily locked on by, let's say, missiles or long-term shell lands on top of him.
Yeah, maps like Enceladus or Valley Forge, or even maps like Dune, where the forward factories don't repair, and because then you have a base that only builds and doesn't repair. Well, if you get in a fight, you return damaged, you can sell your mech and build another one, but you're not getting an assault mech.
Yeah, and the repair gantries on Dune are so open that an aerospace pilot or something like that can pretty easily prevent you from repairing.
Mm-hmm.
The good thing though about a lot of assault mechs is that like a lot of the I don't want to say the meta ones, but there's a lot of assault mechs that have very good force projection, like Madcat Mark II Prime, for example, which has twin Gauss rifles, Lerms, some Euro mediums, or a lot of Masakaris. Like they can do most of their damage like out to 700 meters plus. So some assault pilots, like Evan, for example, very rarely will like be in close quarters. So even if like objectives are somewhat leave you somewhat exposed, if you're good at kind of managing your exposure a lot, or like, okay, these are generally where enemy units are going to be transiting, and I'm just going to be dumping my all my assault gun on them for a short period, that's enough to be very productive. Even if you're not necessarily always on the points, like there are certain types of assaults that are just really good by merit of how much firepower they have and how far they can project it.
Good area denial.
Yeah. So Masakari Alpha, Masakari Prime to a lesser extent, Masakari Bravo, and Atlas Prime, things like this, can still be used even on really massive maps, just because they don't need to necessarily be going all that far to be able to do their damage.
I would say that zoning is the key concept here. Zoning is something that not enough people understand well, in my opinion. Just the ability to control space by punishing anyone that tries to move around in it.
If you play ATM standards, then you kind of get zoning, but yeah.
So I know that we brought up aerospace, but I didn't hear any talk of VTOLs. When in a game is it the appropriate time to take a VTOL?
Never.
Mid-game.
Never. In a pub game, never.
Okay.
In a pub game, never.
Highly dependent.
No, I'm being a little harsh. So VTOLs are in kind of a funny place. They've always been kind of a funny unit. They're overdue for a rework, and that's why they've been kind of sitting in this weird place, because we've got a mostly built rework that hasn't been able to be implemented, that is also hasn't been focused on, because we've got some heavier VTOLs that haven't yet been implemented, and that's kind of, we're kicking the can down the road on this one. But they're basically only good for compared to other units, right? Because the opportunity cost is always what I'm speaking of when I say whether something is good or bad. I'm saying compared to basically a generalist-ish mech of equivalent price. A VTOL is only good for trolling someone who is completely alone, who does not have enough pitch to shoot back at you. Other than that, they have a very strong niche application for back capping. They're pretty much the strongest dedicated back cappers in the game, even stronger than something like a Solitaire or Owens, which are built for that purpose.
Hovercraft, yeah.
Or Hovercraft. Yeah, because
Fast.
they can go anywhere. They can descend directly into the objective and capture it from anywhere.
Yeah, even though they're slower than a masking Solitaire, they can just fly over everything and ignore terrain.
Yeah.
They're also considerably better armed than a Solitaire.
Yeah, and if they don't want to get in a fight, they can just avoid it.
And they have really good radar, so you're not usually going to get, somebody's just not going to show up and surprise you. Unless, somebody spawns at the base.
I do find that late game, a Solitaire or a Hover might end up being a better back capper than a VTOL, especially if the enemy has a lot of aircraft, because as a back capping Solitaire, you can run passive and avoid detection by those aircraft sometimes, whereas a VTOL is going to show up real well.
VTOLs are easy prey for aircraft,
absolutely. Yeah. And any type, especially bombers, actually. Bombers are just delayed VTOLs.
Yeah.
It also exposes lots of ground units, so Blacklanders and Eponas and Regulators and things like that are definitely a lot more survivable and have only a little bit less map presence. They do a
The
lot more
one
damage
thing
too.
that I see VTOLs used to good effect in the late game is pretty much just the evil eye.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say next is that one hawk moth functions very, very well as a spotter. It's funny. It's like I just said VTOLs never take them, but I also just said it's the best back capper in the game. Well, it's also the best spotter in the game, but it requires a very, very skilled player and a steady hand with the tag equipment. And it requires you to be a positioning god and to not get shot at all.
Yeah, for those who might not know, it's a VTOL field with electronics, has a tag, and has a narc, which is like very support heavy.
Yeah, it's got Guardian, electronic countermeasures, C3, and Bloodhound probe.
Air Bloodhound, which I think has even longer, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
So
Yeah. It's to draw an analogy, if you're a cultured person and you've played Dota, it's kind of like Meepo. It's this character that almost no one is willing to touch because it's so ridiculously complex and requires so much micro that, like, why would you ever do that to yourself? But the small number of people who are good at it are like gods at what they do.
They need team. They need team, though. Like Meepo, if I remember correctly, Meepo is scary, right? And can kill people. It cannot kill people by its own.
Dashi Prime is Meepo.
So speaking of meta, we're talking more about meta here. What's the there's a Kodiak that is new, and it's a lot like the Master and Commander Atlas. Have any of you had a chance to drive it in a pub yet?
It got changed though, didn't it? Like it
Yeah, not
previously had
since
some UX
before.
tunes.
Not since before the loadout changed, unfortunately. Because my late game buys have been focused on the new 100-ton tanks, which are even newer. So unfortunately, I haven't really tried any of the assault mech loadouts that have changed in the last patch.
Yeah, I've only gotten to try out that Kodiak in a free play server, so I haven't actually gotten to see how well it fares. I'm thinking that it's a bit more, it's a better missile boat than the Master and Commander, but its narc is less useful because it has 200 meters less range.
Personally, I really don't like taking assault mechs that are meant as like dedicated electronics boats. Like for like an Atlas, the Master and Commander is significantly less. It's like basically an Avatar's amount of firepower. Which is, I mean, it's nice that you have all the armor. It's nice that you have all those electronics, but there's very few situations where it's like, I'd rather just maybe take like a Loki or something, which is a lot squishier but a lot more mobile and has pretty much the same electronics capacity, and lets me put down probably more firepower. That's basically how I feel about most electronics platforms. It's just like, I'll probably just take a Loki Prime. If there's anything else I'm thinking of, if I can afford it.
Sometimes I'll, like if it's pure tech, I might take, even though it's not the best example, I might take the Thanatos Prime for C3.
Same, actually. It's probably one of my favorite late game C3 platforms for IS.
I mean, that's kind of a thing that, I mean, those are support mechs, right? That they're supposed to work in tandem with the team. That's why they're not really used in pubs that much. Also, if in general good players will get something that can contribute more, with their skill instead of, so it's not goes to waste with like C3 Atlas, where you just are really passive. You just launch some missiles here and there, maybe pew pew with lasers, but you're not doing much by your own. You're hoping that your team will use your radar, aura or narc, whatever, right? So it's something that's more prevalent in an organized game.
Yeah, that's what you would call off meta, is stuff that doesn't see frequent use. It's not the sort of thing that anyone relies on or goes to automatically.
It's a lot more narrow in scope.
It's something that you pick to deal with a specific situation or to enable a certain play that you have in mind.
Like if you've got a friendly long tom.
Right.
And you don't feel like taking a Raven.
Yeah, like if a Raven will just die the moment it shows up in front of the enemy team, and you need to both push and provide C3 cover for your team. Well, there's an Atlas.
Or Thanatos Prime. It's a little bit more mobile. That's my favorite for that particular type of situation.
And with the new C3 Master system on a lot of these long toms, you don't need the longer radar range of the Master and Commander as much. because in the past, that Thanatos has to stick within 1,000 meters of the long tom in order to share that C3 data, but whereas the Master and Commander could go 1,400 meters out, and you just don't have to worry about that anymore, at least for assets, your allies that have, what do you call that, the C3 Master. So I did hear mention of that those super heavy tanks. How have they changed the meta?
Whew. Well,
Heavy tanks.
Still don't quite know yet.
quite
Feel a lot.
dramatically, I would say.
Did they?
Their presence has actually upset the metagame in a way that it hasn't resettled yet, and I'm not really sure what it will be. They've only been out for a couple weeks now, and they're also still undergoing frequent balance changes at this point. I will say I think they might be slightly too cheap. They've already been raised in price once, but on maps like Thunder Rift, for example, which is a very, very small map, the active fighting area is about like 1 kilometer across. Sometimes you just see like 4 of them lined up fighting together. It's not uncommon at all because they're basically in the same price range as an 85-ton mech.
Well, I mean, some of the assets, and mostly it's Behemoth, right? Because Mars
well,
is
mostly
more expensive.
Behemoths. Clan stuff is more expensive, yeah.
So I think that Mars all around is really strong. It just packs. It's just so much armor, a lot of weapons. Sure, I think some have like issues with weapon groups.
Most of them have a lot.
There's that one where you have the sniper artillery piece, which is like very skillful, kind of like assault tankish way because it's very short range. But again, it's like long-term shell, point blank, basically shooting people. So this one's very strong. With Behemoths, I didn't try all of the loadouts. In general, they're really strong, except of the HVAC ones. And honestly, I think they're absolute dog shit. They're awful.
Ooh, the Prime is great. It's a little bit hot.
I don't know, man. The HVAC 5, I think, especially. It's just so bad.
It's like I don't know, HVAC 5 is funny. I remember that one point I sat down with, I think, Leeko and a couple other people to test like damage output, and it's very solid. It's like, I think roughly the same. I think it's more burst than a Hack 20. Roughly the same DPS as Light Gauss or more. And Light Gauss has also, it's like...
No, it's equivalent to 2 Light Gauss. It's equivalent to 2 Light Gauss.
For each one. For
It
each
was
HVAC
specifically so the dual high velocity autocannon 5 was specifically designed to replace a quad Light Gauss loadout, which would otherwise be the default extreme range behemoth. So it does approximately the same damage and the same DPS and everything. That's how it was tuned. The trick is that you have to land the entire burst, and that the burst has spread, and it's a long burst. It's the longest burst of any burst weapon in the game. It's like 44 projectiles.
I mean, that's why I can't agree with you. Like, first of all, comparing to, like, sure, it's supposed to take the place, but it doesn't, because Light Gauss is a pinpoint damage, and if you try firing HVAC 5 over 1,200 meters, you'll hit literally everything from the top to the bottom of mech, assuming as well you land every single shot when mech is moving. It's not very realistic.
Well, I took it out in a game on Tukeyed against... I pushed one of the factories basically alone with some teammates way behind me against a Blood Asp and a Mauler that were both slightly pre-damaged and shooting at aircraft at the same time as me. But I came out on top, to my surprise.
But what were you firing at?
A Mauler and a Blood Asp.
But it was like a point blank range, basically, wasn't it?
No, I started at like my furthest extreme range of 1,500 meters, shooting with my ELRMs. I guess that's really where it would shine the most.
Oh yeah, ELRMs they deal more damage than the HVACs. I kind of focus on the HVACs actually, but
Oh yeah.
Because I was testing HVACs, I was curious about the new weapon, and like even firing at the stationary mech, like on Oasis, stationary light mech, I fired like 2 or 3 bursts on it, and it was just spraying all over it, despite it wasn't moving. It
Right.
was completely counterproductive.
Well, I think they would actually be least effective against light mechs because the spread is going to affect you most against a smaller target.
Yeah.
True, but again, at the 1400 meters, it's still like,
But yeah,
One of the things I have noticed change in the meta due to the addition of
you're
the super
breaking
heavy.
off?
Yes,
think?
what?
It's a little hard to hear you.
So one of the things I've noticed change with the super heavy tanks being added, at least with the meta, is late game battle armors. Battle armor have a really hard time getting stuck in big fights when there's a couple behemoths or a Mars or something floating around in there with those auto flamer turrets.
We
Yeah,
haven't touched
those-
BA really, did we?
those auto flamers are brutal. It's hard to get
Yeah.
within 100 meters of one of the new assault tanks.
Funnily enough, I think if you get close enough, like zero range somehow, assuming you don't get killed by the auto flamers, which is not an easy thing to do, but assuming like I don't know, there's enough cover or whatever, and you're able to get within zero range, I think the Mars can't hit you at all when you're there. Like I think the turret might be able to hit you because the turret traverses pretty quick, but that is very much an edge case. For the most part, like you just don't want to be anywhere near them because they will just kill you. Which is funny because BA are usually one of like the hardest counters to tanks, just being able to like kind of run right next to them.
Yeah, we haven't really talked about BAs, have we?
Yeah, when do we normally, like in a normal game with a typical meta, where do we see battle armor most?
When people
Highly
eject,
mech
sadly.
dependent.
When people
There's
eject,
that.
which they shouldn't do.
Yeah, unintentional ejections or at the very end of the game where you can't afford to die. Or I think more commonly, like the most effective use of them is on maps where you have large capture points, and you have like the idea is you just want to deny the point as long as possible for teammates because say your team is being heavily out-tunned and the enemy team is like started rushing like Mirage middle, or maybe say like outskirts or something. The idea is that there you just like you're trying to like keep the enemy team from capturing the point as long as possible, or just take them as long as possible to capture the point. Or that sounded like the same thing, but I mean like you're just trying to deny them tickets. Or if you want to do this, like okay, I want to prevent them from capturing the point in the most ticket efficient way possible, because the battle armor is only worth like 2 tickets, and it would be very hard for them to kill you if you're using cover very effectively. So you just like kind of like Bolter example, for example, it's like really notoriously good at this on like Kandahar and formerly outskirts, but I think it's been changed a little bit, and Mirage. It's just like be hard to kill for as long as possible. And in that time period, even if the enemy team like has control over the area around mid, they're not trading tickets. Otherwise, like BA tend to have like very narrow niches where it's like you stay at the edge of a fight and you do a bunch of damage, and that's basically it. Or you hug mechs with a medium heavy laser, or sorry, man-pack heavy laser, or I can't remember the name.
Micro heavy laser.
Micro heavy laser. That's the M. Yes, man-pack PVC micro heavy laser, and there you just do a ton of damage and hope they're not staring at you. Because you will do a ton of damage until someone clicks you. I mean, they can.
Like, I actually haven't seen that much BA since I started playing again, since the nerf of BA, because
Yeah, they're not as relevant anymore.
yeah, they're not as relevant. The thing with BA was that there are certain players, like mentioned Bolter, I think Saber,
Yeah, Saber definitely.
where BA, actually, I take it back. It wasn't aerospace craft that's the most obnoxious thing you ever can fight in this game. It was BA, but the BA piloted by very specific people. I broke mouse once because of Bolter, I think. I just, lifted up and smashed it so hard against my desk. Those buggers can get between your legs if you're isolated and you don't have tight teammates, or the most frustrating when you have teammates and they just don't notice it because of various radar shenanigans. The thing just packs a lot of very close range punch with the micro heavy laser, with the PPCs, with the SRMs it has. It used to have bombs, which was just another thing. Thankfully, it's no longer a thing. But BA was able to annihilate assault just by getting between their legs and shooting at the rear. Very frustrating. It was very good, and still is very good on city maps where you can just hop on the roof, hide behind the corners, stuff like that.
Yeah,
It's
like the
hard
central
to hit.
base on Mirage, for example. Battle armor can hold that for seemingly far longer than they should be able to sometimes.
Yeah.
Specifically
Delaying-
taking cluster bombs just to kill BA on Mirage mid before.
Delaying the capture of an objective is probably the best use of
Yeah,
battle armor.
Yeah, absolutely.
My personal most frequent use of battle armor is, sometimes I'm just in the mood to jump around in between people's legs frustratingly. It's just a fun thing to do to people. I notice someone has a Hephaestus or Goblin on the field that I can spawn in and buy equipment in and just jump in the fight. That's also fun to just jump right in a fight that's going on. But most of the time, if I respawn in a forward base and I notice that it's already under siege and they're already in the objective and I don't know if I'm going to hold the base long enough to actually have the thing that I'm building finish building. You
Not to
go
mention if it finishes building and just get destroyed before you hop into it, right?
Yeah, or if it seems like you'll automatically die while you're powering up, you switch over to the weapons tab, buy a BA kit, and then hide.
Hide or just try and do as much damage as possible.
And yeah, well, you do both of those things at the same time.
There's some circumstances, let's say I'm playing on Death Valley or something, and it's right at the very beginning, and I had to go take a bathroom break, and so I come in, and my allies are already out on the battlefield, and they're just heading to cap the first base. Like maybe they're heading from the west, and they're heading from the east, and they've just gotten to Fox 7. I can get out, or spawn as battle armor, get out at Fox 7, spawn at somebody's Hephaestus or whatever, help them capture that more quickly, get back in the Hephaestus with them, go down to Gulf 4, and then help them cap that post way more quickly than if I had spawned at main base and grabbed, say, a Solitaire or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And because of that, I'll have extra money, so that once we've captured Gulf 7, that I'll be able to buy something bigger.
People do that a lot on Thunder Rift.
Yeah, jumping down to cap the forward base.
Yep.
Yeah, it's definitely a very good tool of delaying caps. But yeah, again, can be incredibly frustrating to deal with and very good in fighting on mechs, right, and vehicles. It's not as strong as it used to be. It's still strong with good usage.
One of the things I do find to be a good use of battle armor is fighting other battle armor. Just like how we were talking about interceptors, how you take them to kill another plane, well, you take battle armor to kill another battle armor. And
sometimes, because BSRM will kill you in one hit if they're... Oftentimes, if there's a BA that's causing enough trouble where you have to buy something dedicated to kill it, or you're going to go as BA dedicated to kill it, probably the person there is a better shot with their kit than you are. That's usually been my experience.
And so your ultimate goal when you're doing that has to be not that you're trying to make them die faster and make their team lose more tickets than you. You're just trying to get that battle armor off that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
actually,
the thing... go on, Dave.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. You go.
All right. There's one thing before I forget. We've been talking a little bit about about BA's area denial, but the one thing actually that I haven't mentioned so far is BA are really, really, really strong against light mechs, because BA SRMs are these kind of unguided rockets. They do about as much damage as if there was a theoretical T-Bolt 7 or T-Bolt 8 or something. It does almost as much damage as a T-Bolt 10. So if you just buy a bunch of BA SRMs and you are really good shots with those, and you're also a decent shot with whatever other secondary weapons you have, you can completely melt light mechs very fast. So early game, you can be extremely oppressive if you like it in a half and you take a point early, and then you just kind of kill everything that gets close to it. On Death Valley and Mirage especially, I think, is where it's just kind of okay, if a friendly gets to mid with a hef, you are going to give everyone who gets anywhere close a horrible, horrible time. You're probably either going to be able to kill them in a couple of salvos or make them hurt a lot. And if they spend time trying to kill you, they're not going to be able to hit the allies, who are probably all very fast by this point in the game and might be able to take advantage.
It's very high skill ceiling to play BA properly. Because you will die very fast if you don't play properly, if you don't use cover, if you don't move hectically. But also the thing is, if someone's playing dedicated BA, it's not exactly you can ignore it, because if you try to ignore it, which generally would be a good idea, to focus on objective and whatnot, VAs can keep up with mechs by firing PPCs backwards, for example, and just propelling themselves with the PPC. They can keep on chasing and they can keep on shooting your back. So, sometimes you just have to deal with BA. And when you have to deal with BA, just wait for it to pick you. Lasers are great. Some splash is great to kill it. But yeah, just with BA, it's game of patience.
So one thing, meta-wise, that I use battle armor for is I will actually, in a lot of games, if there's enough players, I'll begin in an APC, and I will drive that APC, like on Dune, for example, and hide it either in the water behind one of the forward bases, or behind the rocks behind one of the forward bases, and that way I'm 500 meters out. The Bloodhound probe ravens and things won't be able to see it powered down out there, and I cap the base, and if they ever take the base back from me, then I'll just wait a minute or two and then spawn in and then move in and take the base right back.
Yeah, it can be clutch. Can absolutely be a clutch. And, people will be not sure what's going on, right? They keep on losing the point and stuff. And they cannot find why. BA played properly can be a huge asset. And also can be a huge issue for a team if, 5 people decide to just hop around in BAs and do just jack shit. Right?
Well, we've been talking about this for quite a while, so there's also, we're going to bring up organized terrain control. Any major differences between terrain control and organized terrain control?
Night and day.
Sorry, second, Kidzin?
Night and day difference.
I heard Kidzin, but I didn't hear Direwolf. What did you say, Direwolf?
I just said coordination, and I think that's
Coordination.
basically, that's kind of that's the main difference.
There's also
They're
a
able to
heck of a
talk
lot
to each
more donations that go on in organized terrain control.
C-bill sharing, a lot more of it. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I feel like it is a very different game, but it's hard to say exactly how concisely or in terms of the metagame. It's definitely elevated in terms of the level of coordination and the pace. In a pub game, people react a lot more slowly. Not everyone reads chat. Not everyone reads chat quickly or at the same time. And some people don't react at all until you run right in front of them or shoot weapons in their face and then run towards the enemy to explain to them what they're supposed to be doing. Whereas, in an organized game, you say, everybody push now, and then everybody pushes at the same time, hopefully. So, in a sense, that does change what the tactical possibilities are. But I feel like the overall meta is pretty similar in terms of what people's choices are. Especially because during organized play, I feel like most people will, under pressure, they fall back on what they're comfortable with. And what people are comfortable with largely the things that they play in pub games a lot.
All right.
Yeah, it's coordination. Exactly. It's just coordination.
So because this went so much longer, we didn't really get to delve much into the whole playstyle thing, so I think we'll leave.
I can keep on going.
Yeah, I'm getting a bit exhausted from the. I've got other things to do too, but yeah. So I thought maybe each one of us could bring up maybe a 2 or 3 different asset, like a progression of assets that we might buy in a typical public terrain control game. So I'll start off. I'll give you an example. So I might start off in the Mithras Bravo because it's tier 1 and gets the really big C-bill multiplier, and so it's a good way to rack up some early C-bills. And that's the one with the 1 heavy medium laser, 2 heavy small lasers, and the 2 advanced tactical missile, 3 high explosive launchers. And it also has a anti-battle armor point defense cannon thing on it, or point defense system. I love starting out with that. The asset that I build after that is very much dependent upon how much I make, whether I die as that that Mithras. Frequently, I don't die because I get ignored, because Mithras's people go, oh, it's just a Mithras, whatever, and then they get killed by it. And if I do die, then I'll typically come back in small, medium, or maybe one of the more advanced light mechs. And if I'm really lucky, then I'll be popping into a Thanatos or something like that. So yeah, that's one of my playstyles. How about you all?
Very hard for me to come up with a build order because I try to make I kind of make a point of buying different assets all the time. There are some favorite assets that I use a lot. So probably for starters, probably that's where I'm most diverse in terms of what I choose. But I don't know. One of my old favorites was the Osiris Foxtrot, which has improved jump jets, mask 6.5. Can't remember. I think it's 5 ER small lasers, and a streak serum 4 or 6. Sorry, streak 6. I really like that because it kind of does a bit of everything. It's an Osiris, it's slightly up armored, so it's able to tank a little bit more than a lot of other lights. Has 360 torso, improved jump jets and mask, which means that you're constantly able to break aggro or kind of a little bit more map presence than other Osirises. Not as much as a Solitaire, but it's
better now than it used to be because the ER small lasers, the bug on them got fixed.
Yes, that does more damage now. Finally, I don't know. I really like versatile assets, things that are mobile. And then so second buy is also very dependent on if I wanted to go dive really early in the enemy team. Okay, do I see an enemy player that I don't want them to sit back and farm, so I'm just gonna run in the whole team to kill them. Sometimes I do that, and it's okay, I'm just gonna go buy Chimera or whatever. Whatever I can afford it, 49k. Other times it'll be okay, I can just keep on capping points, I can keep on staying alive through a bunch of brawls, and then suddenly I have 80k or 90k or whatever. I usually go for Shadowcats in mid game because they do a bit of everything. They're a lot of map control, usually put down a lot of firepower, are still useful even if the enemy team had upturned early. So Shadowcat Prime is probably my favorite, or the Bravo of the map, which is the LBX-20. If the map is kind of more close quarters, like Forsaken, or if that's just where the fight happens to be. And then towards late game, I try to take usually pretty mobile clan heavies. Thors are probably one of my favorites. I like the Prime a lot now, especially after it got buffed. The Delta is really, really good on close quarters maps, which is also LBX-20. And the Alpha is a Stalwart, which is UAC-10, ER large, ER medium. Actually, one more, which is new this patch, and I'm always constantly excited for it. 1 clan large pulse, one Gauss rifle, and dual Serum 4 and SRM 6, which is just loads and loads and loads of close range firepower. Plus, a bunch of good skirmishing capabilities, and you have IJJ. It's just beautiful. Does everything you want.
And how about you, Kidzin?
Yeah, I can literally give you if I feel very lazy, I have a very precise way of doing things. Kid Fox, Echo, yeah, the LBX-10, 3 clan small pulse lasers, and double SRM4. It's probably the strongest starter brawler you can grab. The key with it is to not go in first because you're squishy as hell. You stay passive, so you let your teammates be your mid shield, and you just dish out disgusting amount of damage with this thing. Of course, people that know what's up will try to shoot at you, and then you deal with those first. Even though this mech has relatively high tier rating for starters, just the sheer amount of damage it can dish out in the brawls will let you progress really quickly. And key in that progression is not dying as well. So honestly, sometimes I can just stay in that thing until I jump straight in assault. If I have another stop, it's usually at heavies. So with heavy, depending on the map, if it's more open one, there's nothing that speaks volume as Mad Dog Alpha with the twin Gauss. You can often, if you did well in the light, you can often hop into that thing when there are still plenty of lights running around, and you just two-shot them. If map is more city focused, there's the Thanatos with either Heavy Gauss or the LBX-20 works fine. There's fantastic brawlers as well. And for assaults, for me, go-to is the Blood ISP Echo, I think. It's Echo. Other twin clan Gauss, double heavy large lasers, some machine guns that you would forget they exist usually. Fast clan mech, 360 torso, just like Mad Dog. It's actually it's kind of they share similar thing that they're more of a skirmishers, right? They're not exactly snipers. At least I don't play them like that. I play them as skirmishers, where you still play objective and whatnot, but you usually stay out of frontal fight and just focus on killing the key assets. Yeah, that's basically how I play GoTo if I want to hard try.
And Leeko, what sort of build order might you go with?
Well, for me, it's kind of the opposite of Direwolf, I would say, where my starters are the least diverse. I choose the Kitfox Prime, or the Uller Prime, as some would call it, for nearly every first pick of nearly every game. Simply because it is an unbeatable generalist in a 1v1 situation. It's got a tool for every matchup and opponent. It's got enough pitch to shoot back at an early VTOL. I could sing its praises and go on about it forever, but it's a great mech.
LBX to deal with vehicles.
Yep. BA vehicles, everything. It's a wonderful mech. If you give it a try and if you play it a lot, you'll get good at running and fighting at the same time. You'll get good at shooting battle armor underneath your feet with SRMs, and a lot of other important skills. And you'll get good at managing a lot of weapon groups, because you really need to use 5 weapon groups to make the most of it, in my opinion. And from there, I try to try everything in the game and enjoy all the variety that Living Legends has to offer. So it's hard for me to think of like a typical buy path for myself. I guess what would be typical for most players would be something like jumping to a Chimera or Shadowcat. But for me, I try to hold off on upgrading as long as possible to avoid giving more C-bills to the enemy, and also because I really enjoy my Kitfox Prime. So my second buys tend to be heavies usually. I would say most common would be probably a Warhammer, because they're darn cheap. You can build them at forward bases, and you can pull them out early enough that you can really bully some light mechs away from objectives, hold terrain very well. Warhammer Prime gets a shout out for being basically the same price as a Puma Prime, which is half its weight.
That's a standard engine for you.
Yeah, it's lovely. The standard engine also just got a buff. And for a third buy,
the buff you're speaking of is for the severity of the slowdown when your back torso is shot out, right?
Yes, that's correct. Standard engines are not penalized as harsh when their back armor gets shot out. A third buy, that's really situational. It depends a lot on whether I would want to go for something more mobile like a Mad Cat or a Marauder, or whether I want to invest in Assault. At this point, I would say my end game is probably a Thumper Behemoth. The Behemoth Echo has the Thumper Cannon, 8 Thunderbolt 5s that are a lot of fun to chain fire at people, and some medium lasers.
I hate you.
Isn't it 6?
Oh no, sorry,
It's
6.
It's
6
six.
T-Bolt 5s. 8 is
Yeah.
the canonical loadout. I get that confused sometimes. 6 Thunderbolt 5s.
It'd be
Still very
horrific
fun.
at 8.
All right, well, I'll do the outro here. Thanks all for being here. This has been Returning to Base, a Mechwarrior Living Legends podcast. I'd like to give a shout out to Timothy Seals for giving us our intro music, and Shavaxi for giving us our outro music. I hope you listen in next time.